I sit at the back, and then you like to see the person who's speaking. Thank you.
Mr. Kant, Dr. Ahluwalia, Dr. Katuria, ladies and gentlemen, what I'm going to try and do in the next 10 minutes or so is give you some flavor of what I think is the role of G20 in the global conversation. I, of course, say this partly from the perspective of the Government of India, but also more specifically as co-chair of the Framework Working Group of the G20, which, as some of you know, is arguably one of the more active and important working groups of G20. So what I'll try and do is give you some flavor of why G20 is an important forum and what it should do going forward. Now, G20 is one of many institutions that were created after World War II to provide global leadership. And of course, all of you know about the United Nations, WTO, IMF, World Bank, and so on. There were also regional platforms for providing leadership like the ADB and others. The problem was that in their attempt to be perhaps very inclusive and and bring everybody on board, it was realized very quickly that these institutions became very large, unwieldy. They ended up with large secretariats, became bureaucratic. And so very quickly, the business of providing leadership became somewhat difficult. In the end, leadership is an activity which a relatively small group of people have to provide. It requires making difficult trade-offs, and large platforms which, while for certain activities may be good, for providing leadership were found very difficult. The second major problem was, of course, that many of these platforms, under the glare of the media, had a tendency to become ritualized. A lot of grandstanding would happen, and effectively, deals cannot be done in these situations. So, at some point, I think it was in the 80s or early 90s, a new forum emerged out of it, involving relatively small people, but with a very North Atlantic bias, which was the G7. Over time, that has now got widened into the G20. This is now, in some ways, the premier or main platform that provides a place and space for global leaders to come together, discuss real issues, and much of these discussions are, of course, held behind closed doors so that real discussions actually happen. So this is, I think, where it stands right now. And of course, this, as Dr. Ahluwalia pointed out, this platform in some ways earned its stripes during the 2007-8 global crisis and was arguably one of the main platforms which are used for global coordination on a variety of issues. As things stand now, it now has two tracks. One is the Sherpa track, and the other is the finance track, of which the Framework Working Group that I co-chair is a part. One of the interesting things of G20, however, is that it has consciously avoided having a permanent secretariat. The secretariat every year changes according to who is the presidency. So right now, to the extent possible, it is provided by the Argentinians. And then, of course, the various working groups have their own internal networks. It is deliberately informal. It keeps changing. And I think this is how it always should be. Because the experience with the standing bureaucracies is that very often they tend to get quickly fossilized and are unable, or sometimes simply unwilling, because of the internal dynamics, to take on the evolving nature of global challenges. But however, there is a danger here, and something that I will allude to later as well during the course of the day, that this group ends up trying to do too much. Because in an attempt to do too much, and by creating ever more working groups and ever more tracks, we will end up essentially recreating what the dozens of different institutions and platforms that already exist do. What greater value will be brought by doing that? So I think there are a few things in which the G20 should take leadership. One of them could be, of course, matters related to strategic issues. But there are 2 or 3 things which they do all the time, which may last for quite some time, which I'm going to allude to. One is the issue of a global financial architecture. Now, obviously, the IMF and the World Bank are an important part of that. And of course, over this weekend, they will be having their annual meetings in Bali. But nevertheless, I think having a serious discussion behind closed doors about the global financial architecture is absolutely critical going forward. Way too many things are sort of generically accepted because they happen to be what, at some point in time, the global technocracy happened to have accepted, and then gets regularized over time and doesn't ever get questioned again. And I'll give you the example of Basel III. Basel III is now considered the gold standard by which we believe in regulating financial systems around the world. I will not get into which countries have or haven't implemented these. That is a different debate altogether. I'm going to raise the issue of, is Basel III the most sensible way of regulating and managing financial systems in countries and world over? And I'm not at all convinced that that is the case. And many academic arguments have been made. But one of the real issues which I have raised and I will continue to raise is the fact that Basel, the whole approach of Basel, and particularly of Basel III, is that of building a Chinese wall. If a 10-foot wall didn't do the job, then surely a 20-foot wall will do the job. But as everybody knows with the Chinese wall, it repeatedly failed to keep the Mongols out. And so this whole business of Basel III, which in my view is way too prescriptive, way too rigid, and dangerously removing genetic diversity in the way risks are managed in the financial system globally, this may lead eventually to a much more brittle financial system if everybody actually imposes it. And yet there is absolutely no debate on the importance or the risks to this Basel approach to managing global risk. Now, I'm not saying that I have immediately a great alternative, but I do think that such a debate needs to happen, and G20 is a good place that such a debate could be had. Similarly, the whole debate around future of work, which incidentally is an important part of the current presidency's agenda. As Amitabh just pointed out, we are at the threshold of a major shift in the way technology impacts our lives. But the far greater danger than artificial intelligence is the natural stupidity of the Luddite way of thinking. So we have no choice. We have to adapt to this. And as again I will discuss later in the day when we have a session on future of work, India actually can benefit enormously from this new technologies and leapfrog massively. The reason for that is, among others, that one of the biggest constraints to adoption of technology is in fact not even education, which is of course important, and human capital and various other things, or even regulation, But in fact, the biggest constraint throughout, if you take a longer, and I now speak with my historian hat on, the biggest constraint tends to be political. And it happens because entrenched interest groups of various kinds essentially deliberately retard adoption of new technologies. Now, here there is good news, because in the many segments where this new technologies will come in particularly the artificial intelligence technologies, is not interestingly at the bottom end of the spectrum. Artificial intelligence does not replace people at the bottom. Many of the jobs that artificial intelligence can do are actually highly skilled jobs. As you just heard, artificial intelligence can now beat most grandmasters at various games like Go or chess. Now, being a grandmaster in chess is a high-skill activity. Artificial intelligence can already make music. Artificial intelligence can do a lot of legal work. These are high-skill jobs. These are not low-skill jobs that are going to be replaced by many of these things. There will also be low-skill jobs, but in fact, interestingly, the threat of most of these new technologies is actually fairly high up in the value chain. And in many of these areas, because we are a developing country, we actually do not have existing entrenched interest groups, which is a good thing, because we can evolve into this new world as we move up the chain, rather than spend a large amount of energy, which many of the Western countries will expend, on trying to shift existing regulations, existing workforces onto this new track. And I will come to this a little bit later in the day as well. So I've just given you a brief flavor of the kinds of things that a group like the G20 can do. It can, most importantly, be a forum and platform for taking on issues that turn up at our doorstep as history evolves. This is precisely how global leadership should be, which is an evolving, loose, rapidly adapting leadership, which sadly, many standing institutions are simply not capable of providing. So I hope that the G20 will always remain slim. I hope the G20 will never, ever end up with a standing secretariat, even though that provides jobs for people like me. And I hope that the G20 will always retain that somewhat informal architecture that it has so far at least managed to retain. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Sanjeev. You just failed to mention another always, which is I hope that ICRIER will always have an annual G20 conference, providing an opportunity for us all to brainstorm. With that, thank you very much. And we now, why don't you take over for the message, Rajat? Yeah?
Yes. Before that, let me just say, inshallah, I hope we could continue to have the G20 conference as long as the G20 lasts. So before we end the morning session, we have a short video message from the Commerce Minister and also the Civil Aviation Minister, Mr. Suresh Prabhu. He really wanted to come, but he could not, and he has a really short message for us. He's inaugurated one of our earlier G20 conferences as well.
I congratulate ICRIER for organizing this event. G20 has emerged as one of the very important bloc of countries, together constituting almost 85% of the global economy, at a time when there has been one of the greatest uncertainty in the world. 2008 was a landmark year where the world really turned around, but I think many countries were affected. This time it's a very unique situation. First time we are seeing dark clouds over global trade. We are seeing that monetary policy of some of the developed countries is affecting developing countries very adversely. I fully understand and appreciate the sovereign right of all countries to take their own monetary policy. But it is also important to look at how adversely it will impact the other countries, particularly the developing countries, emerging countries. And we are seeing now the adverse impact of that on emerging markets all over the world. The global trade, which we have taken it for granted, is facing new challenges. We must be careful to make sure that India becomes a champion of global trade, free trade. Therefore, we had organized on 19th and 20th of March earlier this year a mini ministerial which attended by 53 countries, the biggest ever mini ministerial anywhere. And we are taking a lot of steps to find out how global trade will be expanded. India will play a critical as well as positive role to make that happen. So G20 meeting will take place at a time when they will have a responsibility of ensuring how do you steer the world out of this present situation and make sure that global trade expands, world economy expands so that everybody will benefit. I wish all the great success to this endeavor. ICRIER is a great institution. Rajat is a very good person with navigate. I wish them all the success. I wish I could attend it in person, but please accept my best wishes.
Well, with that, we end the first session, and I invite you all for a cup of coffee. Thank you. Rajat, आ जाओ, आप भी आ जाओ.
Come, Raj.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. बहुत
भाई
अच्छा.
एक आपको कहना है, सब कुछ ठीक है. 2 बार कहा वेस्ट टू एनर्जी. मेरे पास एक ट्यूटोरियल के लिए आ जाओ.